Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to risk, business continuity, COVID, well-being, disaster planning, emergency management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community plan for, prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. One other announcement, I will be speaking at the Continuity Insights Conference in Louisville, Kentucky, April 25th to 27th. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. Feel free, come up and say hi, and maybe we'll get you on the show. I've said for quite a while that I would be speaking at various conferences, over time, and in the summer, there was the BCI Horizons Conference, and I said, it would be nice if we could get some of those speakers to maybe come on the show and talk about their topic or something else that excites them, and today is one of those days. Speaking on the topic of managing external risks, I'd like to welcome to the show Tony Thornton. Tony, welcome.
Hey, Alex, and thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Tony was one of those people who reached out to be on the show. See, so if you reach out, I really do try to get you on here. He may regret it, but he's here.
Not at all. Delighted.
Tony, I've obviously read your bio, and we've talked a little bit through email and such, but could you take a minute or two and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what you do?
Yeah, sure. I think, Alex, it's fair to say that I've had something of a varied career. An atypical one, if you will. It started off as an officer in the British Army, where I spent 4 years, and during that time, actually, I found that I had a particular strength in training, in making training different, making training realistic, making it interesting. And so I don't think that it was any surprise that the next natural step after I'd left the army was to go into a career in teaching. It actually wasn't that straightforward. It wasn't a smooth move from the military into teaching. I spent time in many other jobs, getting lots of other experience. Like I was once an office angel, doing filing in an underground basement of a warehouse. I was a labourer on a building site in the Isle of Dogs. I was a gardener and a baker and a Meals on Wheels driver and all sorts of other things before ending up in teaching. And one of the things I enjoyed most about teaching actually was that I was able to adapt the methods of instruction which I'd learned in the military to the civilian classroom with unexpected and great success actually. Just a very quick anecdote, if I may, just to illustrate that point. I had quite a difficult class to deal with in the East End of London as a teacher, and I was trying to take the register in the morning, and it was just impossible. I was getting bombarded with things, and literally getting bombarded with things, and people shouting out other people's names. It was hopeless. So having got to the edge of my patience, I marched them all out into the rainy playground, sized them all off, put them on parade, and we did a military-style roll call instead of taking a classroom register. And the kids absolutely loved it. They absolutely loved it. And in fact, that started off a thing then whereby at playtimes and lunchtimes they used to come in to get some more lessons in drill and things like this. So it's amazing how you can take a skill from one environment and use it in a different one to great success. So after about 12 years in teaching, though, my career took a bit of a turn, and I went into the world of private security and facilitating or helping organizations and companies to do business in extremely difficult surroundings. So I spent the next few years helping companies in countries like Iraq, and then Jordan and Pakistan and Nigeria, and so on. And I think actually, it was at that time that I realized the importance of getting risk management right, and the importance of using clear language, and the importance of being able to make decisions with no time in very difficult circumstances. And that really set me up, I think, for my next role, which was that of as global head of security for a rather large company that had its headquarters in Copenhagen. So when you get a call in your middle of the Niger Delta and somebody offers you a job in Copenhagen, it's quite an easy decision to make. So I went there as global head of security, and since then I have been advising businesses and trying to help them get their risk management processes and their business continuity programs to do a number of things, to get them to take it seriously and to implement the program and to practice it. And that's what I've been doing really for the last 15 or so years. And here I am now, Alex, talking to you.
Hey, you made it to the best part of them all, right? Just kidding.
The pinnacle.
You touched on some of the things we're going to talk about today. Actually, you even said the word jargon, and that's one of the things. The first thing we're going to talk about today. So, our business jargon, it's changing. It's confusing sometimes. Can you explain why it changes so much, and why there's confusion around it sometimes?
Yeah, this is a point very, very close to my heart, Alex, actually, so I'm glad you asked it. Give me a chance to try and explain what I feel has gone wrong, and it has gone wrong. Modern business jargon, or the use of modern business jargon, introduces more risks. It introduces, the possibility of people misinterpreting key instructions, key advice. They misinterpret that. It opens up the risk, the risk of people not understanding because they're from a different country and they don't speak the language in their mother tongue. There's so many different problems with people not using clarity of language. And I think, people will probably shout me down for this, but it's my point of view in the years that I've spent on both sides of the consulting fence. And I think consultancies have got a lot to answer for here. If you're trying to implement something, let's say a risk management framework, or you're trying to organize some business continuity exercise, or whatever it may be, you've got a lot of consultancies out there that all offer pretty standard stuff. They all offer in the same thing. It's just wrapped up differently. But when the consultants come in, they have to have that little added extra to distinguish themselves from the other consultancies, to say, look, this isn't the same as everybody else's, this is different. And one of the tools they use to do that is that they paint it with fancy language, and they start introducing words and phrases that never should have been introduced into that context at all. And they do that because they delude themselves into thinking they're coming across as highly intelligent. Now, the problem is that a lot of the customers are duped by this, and they're afraid, for fear of ridicule, to actually say that they don't understand what the language is being used is all about, and could they please rephrase. So they then decide to use the same tool and adopt that language internally to their own peers. And so the thing spirals out of control, and we end up with an emperor's clothes scenario, where everybody knows it's absolutely ridiculous, but nobody's going to speak up and say so. So the kind of phrases that I'm talking about are, let's see if I can think of an example off the top of my head. If for example, I said to you, Alex, I think what we should do is take the top 3 risks, and then let's get in touch with our strategy department, and let's study and examine these risks a little bit further. I think that would be a pretty clear message to you, that we're going to take the top 3 risks, we're going to go to our strategy people, and we're going to discuss them and examine them further. But if I said to you, Alex, let's size off the big ticket numbers out of this list, and then let's reach out to our strategic stakeholders so that we can double click on a few of these items and take a deep dive down into them. It's just not quite so clear. If you're telling that to somebody who doesn't have English as their foreign language, taking a deep dive and double clicking on something is just taking things a bit too far. I think there's another one which irritates me intensely, which is where, when you're trying to talk about quick wins or things that you can achieve relatively easily, you don't want to talk about getting in a huddle and peeling back the onion so that you can see where the low-hanging fruit is, so that you can harvest all that in. why don't you just say what you mean? And that's another one that irritates me intensely. The use of the word leverage now is cropped into consultancy speak. Rather than use what we've got, you no longer use what you've got. You leverage upon your assets. That's what you do. You don't use what you. But and this is the kind of thing. But I in a sense, I'm ridiculing it. I don't mean to ridicule it, but what I do mean to do is to emphasize the point that if you are dealing with something as important as risk management, where the business objectives are at stake, if you're dealing with something as important in business continuity management, which aims to minimize any disruption to your processes, and if you're talking about events that could have catastrophic consequences, such as those that we faced in more of the hostile areas, and if in this in this global business society where we've got multiple workforces, all from different nationalities now, that do not have English as their first language, the imperative is to work on being clear with our language and not being clever with our language, because it's self-defeating.
It's interesting that you brought this point up, because earlier this week, I was attending a conference. It's a virtual conference based out of Toronto, the Continuity and Resilience Today conference, and they had emergency management and business continuity managers, or business continuity sides of two major streams. And a lot of us had the same terms, but we had different meanings attached to them. So sometimes we couldn't really, they were, especially people that hadn't been around for a long time, couldn't really understand, well, what does that mean to you? Well, it means this, but that's not what it means to me. So, people were on different pages. And actually at the same conference 3 or 4 years ago, I was on a panel discussion at the end where the person beside me, the question was, what is one of the things that drives you crazy, basically, about business continuity, let's say. And she banged on the table and she said, terminology. She goes, everybody uses different terms, and it's different meanings, different organizations and standards. And then I spoke, it was my turn to talk, and the head of the Business Continuity Institute Canada was there, the head of the Disaster Recovery Institute Canada was there, and a couple of other heads of different organizations were there. And I said, well, maybe you guys should get together and fix this problem. And they were all sitting in the front, and the looks I got, I'll say, were not that favorable. But all the people behind them were nodding their heads, saying, yeah, that would be nice if we had standard set of definitions, terminology that we all understood. So it's interesting to hear you speak, in security and risk, that the same thing occurs there too.
Exactly, and I think one of the biggest examples of that, Alex, actually is the concept of inherent risk. And inherent risk means something to some people, but something completely different to others. And it's essential that is got right. I saw somebody get torn apart at a board meeting once, and actually they were doing exactly the right thing. To them, an inherent risk was was a risk that had been assessed in the absence of any controls. There's no controls whatsoever in place. But there was a new stakeholder involved in the board. To them, oddly enough, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, it's illustrating your point, it's different definitions of the same terms. To them, an inherent risk is the risk as it is today, and they argued at the point that they call it that because they've sort of inherited that risk. It's inherited for all the work that's done before. Now they're in charge, they've inherited it, so it's their inherent risk. That was their description of it, and that was their company's understanding of it. It wasn't our company's understanding of it. So you've got people at board levels disagreeing entirely on what your inherent and your residual risks are. So I completely support your little talk there, and the people in that front row looking at you strangely really do need to wake up, because this problem of language is a real one. You've got to get your language right, and then of course once you've got your use of words right at that basic level, then you can apply that to your specialism. So I mean, one of the big things for me, again close to my heart, is the articulation of risk. That risk title as opposed to the risk description. If you get that right, everything else will fall into place. You get that wrong and you open up a can of worms. Everything becomes ambiguous and nothing's really clear anymore. So yeah, your people that are looking at you strangely, they really do need to wake up, because it's a fundamental thing that we're able to communicate properly, especially in the areas of risk and BCF.
You got me thinking of something else too, because you mentioned a lot of times English is not their first language, a person's first language. Well, if you've got someone who's gone through the training or the education to learn English, then they have specific definitions, that they've learned. Continuity means this, emergency means that, risk means, something else, And then if we come in the risk industry, security industry, or security, or some guiding group, or consultancy, whatever, and come in with our own special definitions, then we're creating some of our own problems with communication and trying to mitigate and resolve issues, because we've changed our understandings and definitions to people that have taken the time to actually learn the real definitions. We're creating our own problem.
You are, and in doing that, you're isolating people who have a very, very valuable input and years of experience, and that you're completely cutting them out of the conversation, because you're disadvantaging them unfairly because of what you're doing with the language. But again, your point, Alex, raises another question on the issue of language, and as countries teach language in a certain way and they attach definitions in a certain way, and it's important that if we are going to that country, we understand what language they're using, what definitions they're using. The question that springs to mind is who is in charge of all this, so that the whole thing is calibrated from country to country to country to country, and from culture to culture to culture. So, for example, over in the Middle East, I'm sure nobody will be offended, but very often the men refer to, expat men, other men, they refer to them as dear all the time. But in the UK, if a man refers to another man as dear, it doesn't have the same, it would be perceived to be not abnormal, but certainly not usual. But over in the Middle East, men refer to other men as dear. It's perfectly normal. It's a silly example, but the point remains the same. We need to calibrate our language so that when we come, similarly, ICS is this crisis management, the command system, whereby people can come from all over the world and take a chair on a crisis management committee and carry out a role. And the reason they're able to do that is because ICS is standardized across all the different countries and all the different crisis management systems. Similarly, in the military, if you look at the American Army or the American Marines, if you look at the format of how they give orders, it's almost exactly the same as how the British Army issue orders, and all the European armies issue orders. And there's a reason for that, and that is because when we all come together and somebody has to issue orders to a multinational force, everybody exactly understands what's coming next and what it means. So we do need to get our language straight.
Yeah, that would be nice. Have the same terminology, understandings. That would be nice. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. Today, we are talking with Tony Thornton on the topic of managing external risks, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Today, we are talking with Tony Thornton on the topic of managing external risks. Tony, in your presentation at BCI Horizons, you talked about IPEC risks. What does IPEC stand for?
IPEC, you won't find IPEC in any textbooks or any papers, Alex. I invented that acronym IPEC, and I invented it because I felt there was a need to categorize a certain kind of risk so that we can deal with it differently than we traditionally do with other sort of strategic, operational, financial, compliance type risks. And the reason I chose the word IPEC was obviously, firstly, because the initials I, P, E, and C, they are the common characteristics of these risks, which I'll mention in a moment. But also, I spent most of my time in risk management within the oil and gas industry, and by calling them IPEC, that sort of resonates with OPEC And I thought that might sort of, people might remember it, might be a way of remembering it a little more easily. IPEC stands for risks over which we have no influence, risks which are perpetual, risks which are external to our environment, and risks which, if they are realized, will have catastrophic consequences. So when we say we have no influence over them, let's deal with the I first. Obviously, it's tied up with the E because they're external. The amount of influence we have over them is limited. But what we don't have over them, and when we talk about IPEC risk, is influence over their likelihood. We have no influence over them at all. Let me illustrate that if I can. If we take a risk off the top of my head, let's say that we are in a manufacturing industry and we've got a risk identified there, which is the possibility of a fire breaking out in the warehouse. Let's say, okay, so now we examine that, or if you will, we do a deep dive now. We do a deep dive into that risk. And we look at the causes of that risk, and we look at the warehouse and we say, okay, the warehouse is pretty old. It's not fireproof, the material it's made out of. The wiring in the building is particularly ancient, and in areas it's corroded. The workers are allowed to smoke in there. A lot of our stuff is combustible, and so on and so forth, right? And then you say, okay, well, there's likely factors that could result in a fire in a warehouse, and if the fire does happen, what is the outcome of that? And you say, well, we're going to lose all our stock. That's all going to go up in smoke. We're going to maybe have to stop production because there's nowhere to store the stuff once we've made it. We're going to have to call upon insurance if indeed we are insured for that warehouse, and what does the insurance cover? And we're going to either have to rebuild or move. And so the very, in a very simple terms, there's your bow tie, there's your causes and the incident, and there's the outcomes. But because it's internal to you, you can influence that, you see. So whereas you've got the possibility of fire breaking out as a high risk, you look at each one of those causes and you say, okay, well, we'll stop people from smoking in the warehouse. Done, finished. We'll put up fire retardant panels all over the walls and the ceiling of the warehouse. We may even relocate to a new warehouse. We could rewire all the warehouse and so on and so forth. If the fire does break out, we could put in a sprinkler system to deal with that. We'll make sure the fire extinguishers are distributed everywhere and everybody's trained up in them, and we'll have a hotline to the fire brigade. So you're taking that risk of possibility of fire from the top right of the old matrix there, where it's a high risk. And by influencing, in this case, both the likelihood of that event occurring and the impact of that event on the business, you've influenced them both, you've decreased them both, and so the risk rating has come down. Okay, straightforward, basic, simple risk management. But let's take the same warehouse, and if the risk isn't the possibility of fire, if the risk is the possibility of an earthquake, what actions are you going to take to limit the likelihood of that? There's nothing you can do. If you're on a floodplain and you say the possibility of being flooded, again, there's very little you can do. If there's going to be a terrorist attack on that, an unprecedented terrorist attack on your warehouse, what are you going to do about this? Nothing you can do to alter or influence the likelihood of these events because they're outside of your control. The best that you can do is put up the barriers and prepare for the worst. And that's what we mean by no influence. You cannot deal with these external potentially catastrophic events like tornadoes, like volcanoes, like terrorist attacks, like the market crash, or all these external things. You can't deal with those in the same way that you could deal with, for example, a process safety event on a plant or in a refinery or wherever it may be. They have to be dealt with separately because you cannot influence the likelihood of these things. So that's your I. You've got no influence over the likelihood. And the other thing is, if you just go back briefly to our fire risk, you're never going to, no risks will ever go away. You can never write it off, but you can reduce it from high down to whatever category you've chosen. and some risks, to use a phrase I read about recently, which is, I believe it's becoming more in vogue at the moment. That's another one of these language issues, of course, though, Alex. They're now using the term de minimis. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a new language we need to get used to. De minimis means you've reduced the risk to something so small that it's negligible. That's what it means. So you can reduce a risk to de minimis now. So they say. There you go.
Oh.
Then it is. There you go. So, so you're taking a risk that was originally high. Now you've reduced it to extremely low. The problem with the IPEC risks is that they're perpetual. They ain't going to go away. You can't reduce them from A to B, and they're always going to be potentially catastrophic. So they're perpetual, and that's your P. The E we've dealt with. They are outside of your remit, outside of your control. If they were within your remit, within your control, you have more influence over them, and then therefore to reduce the risk and the impact on the business. But you don't. They're external, and it's the E. And catastrophic, catastrophic, what does that mean? It essentially means it's the end of potentially the end of your business if you haven't got all your ducks in a row, to use another poor use of language there. If you haven't got everything organized, your insurance is in place, your contingency plans in place, your crisis management in place, your business continuity plans have been well rehearsed. If you haven't got all of that in place, then the results could truly be catastrophic. So you can't influence them. They're perpetual, they're external, and they're potentially catastrophic, hence IPEC.
Is an example of perpetual risk something like an earthquake? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Like, there's no, we may have stronger buildings, we may have evacuation plans or whatever the case may be, but there's nothing we can actually do about the earthquake itself. Is that a good example of a perpetual one?
It's a very good example, and absolutely illustrates what an IPEC risk is about. And what you've said there, you could try and earthquake-proof your buildings and do all the rest. But what you're doing there is you're trying to manage the impact of the earthquake happening. That's what you're doing, and that's my point. You can do that. IPEC risks is all about focusing on the impact and trying to manage and reduce that impact as much as you possibly can. You can't stop an earthquake from happening. That's the point. But I would like to illustrate something else that you've just triggered my mind, which I think it's important to mention. If we take, trying to think of, if we take volcanoes now as a volcanic eruption, let's take that as another IPEC type risk. Would it be reasonable for a head office of a multinational, let's say, a head office of a multinational based in London, would it be reasonable for that head office to have earthquake on its list of top risks? I suspect that most people would think that was bizarre. If you're a head office based in London and you're presenting to the board and a volcanic eruption is on there, you may get laughed out of the boardroom. But here's my thing. Think Iceland and think 2010. That volcanic eruption by that unpronounceable volcano sent an ash cloud over the northern hemisphere that completely disrupted international air freight. Right. So if your staff are using aeroplanes to get onto their business, if you're using air routes to export products or to import feedstock or whatever it may be, all that lot gets disrupted. And if your head office and you haven't even considered that, when that volcano erupts again and that ash cloud comes over to Europe again and all your air traffic gets disrupted again, more the fool you, actually. And if the people in the boardroom are going to laugh you out of the boardroom because of that, I think if you wake them up in the same way that your people in your front row need waking up to the fact that when you're doing your risk assessments and you're considering IPEC risks, you consider the global context. And this, I think, is where the reporting of IPEC risks becomes ever so valuable to companies now. If we can get over this foolish, childish attitude that, some things are just ridiculous, and we can actually be sensible and say, look, earthquakes have happened. and affected people and businesses. Floods have happened, terrorist attacks have happened, volcanic eruptions have happened. We are in a global business with a multinational company. We're not just looking in isolation of in our office and our area of operations. If you look at the global supply chain, right from getting in feedstock, right to exporting product and everything that goes on in between, and you don't consider that in one of those places that's key to that supply chain, one of these events might happen. And if it does, it could really make your day pretty miserable. If you don't even consider that because it sounds ridiculous, as I say, more the fool you.
Well, you mentioned Iceland and the impact that had. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a year or two after Iceland, it happened again in Indonesia or Malaysia, somewhere around there, where that whole area, Northern Australia and other places, countries were all impacted the same way. Flights were cut, nobody could do things. A lot of stuff was canceled because you couldn't go anywhere. It was, couldn't go outside. In one place, I remember so much ash that even though they weren't in the same country where it occurred, they had to stay inside because so much ash was falling.
Yeah. And the trouble, the sad fact though, is that people only take IPEC type of risks seriously after they've experienced one. So let me illustrate that, and I'm sure this won't come as any surprise. I was facilitating a risk workshop for a very large company recently, and it was 2 years ago, January. I think you've probably guessed what's coming next, but I'm going to tell you anyway. At the end of the risk workshop, even though it was in the bucket of risks which I'd given them to play with, it never featured. And I said to them, have you never considered the issue of a pandemic and the impact that might have? And the answer, this is the senior management team, the answer unanimously and confidently came back, said, look, we've never had a pandemic here. And even if we have one, we're so well equipped to deal with things that really, I think the impact would be minimal. That company lost billions. Pandemic is right up there with your IPEC risks as well. Look at the impact this one's had. I mean, how many interesting, Alex, I don't know, but we can't do it now and nobody would admit it anyway, but wouldn't it be interesting to look at all the top companies, top risk registers, at board level 3 years ago and ask yourself, how many of those considered pandemic? And look at the top risk registers now and see how many are considering pandemic or the effects of a future pandemic or a future mutation, and so on. It's vastly different. And as I say, it's a sad thing that it takes people to get hurt really badly before they start taking things seriously. And what's even sadder, actually, is that those people that have the vision, to say, this could happen, and if it does, we'll be in a bad state, are very often just written off and not taken seriously at all. And what that does, it creates a climate of fear of ridicule, fear of losing your job for speaking up, and people don't speak up. So the only thing that's left, if you're not going to take that seriously, the only thing that's left is to wait for it to happen. And that's the only way you're going to learn. Terrorism. Terrorism is a great IPEC risk because it completely, the whole point of terrorism is to create as much horror and shock and get as much publicity as possible for killing, as many innocent people as possible. It's the most shocking thing, it's one of the most, if not the most shocking characteristic of humanity that we are prepared to do that. But you mentioned a terrorist attack in some companies' risk registers. It's almost taboo. You can't even talk about it. Why not? I think we should be talking about terrorism. We should be talking about pandemic. We should be talking about volcanic eruption. We should be talking about earthquake, about mudslides, about locust swarms in Malaysia, and all the other things that have affected the global businesses. We should be talking about an awful lot more. And here's the thing, Alex, as soon as you start talking about these things a lot more, the more familiar you become talking about them, and the more comfortable then you become. They no longer become some alien thing that's just, is taboo. You become comfortable talking about them, and as soon as you're able to do that, the sooner you're able to start actually taking them seriously and doing some scenario planning behind those and getting your crisis management, your business continuity plans developed.
Now, just to add a point to something you said, a lot of companies probably didn't have pandemic on their risk registry or even in their minds anywhere. I was lucky enough to work for a company that did way back when, because we were impacted by SARS. We had to split our staff. We even had a couple of staff members who contracted SARS and were isolated and things. So we had a pandemic plan, and I'm sure they probably did quite well, when the pandemic hit, because we took a lot of lessons learned from what we went through with SARS. So fingers crossed, everything went well for them. But you're right, a lot of people still thought that that's never going to happen. That was 100 years ago. We've learned so much that would never happen here. Well, here we are, almost 2 years later.
That's it. There we are. And there's one issue though, Alex. I think I should clarify if I've got the time to do so. And that is, I imagine a lot of your listeners out there now, especially the ones involved in risk management, business continuity management, a lot of your listeners are saying, this is nothing new. We know this already. This is black swan events. This is what he's talking about. He's not identifying anything new. It's black swan events, or these are just business continuity risks. I want to deal with both of those things just to clear up the difference between an IPEC risk and a black swan risk and a so-called business continuity risk. To me, I mean, my understanding of a black swan event is one that is characterized by its unpredictability, right? This may not be the intent of the great man himself, Nassim Taleb, but it's my understanding, and I'm just putting it out there so that people can see my point of view, and maybe it'll make things clearer for them about why these two things are different. And if I could illustrate the difference between the two by telling a rather childish story. If you can imagine back in prehistoric times, Alex, and you're a lizard, let's say, you're a small kind of lizard. Back in prehistoric times, and you're around the sort of campfire with your fellow lizards, and you're doing a sort of risk brainstorming session, and you have the possibility that we're going to get eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or the risk that we won't be able to find any food today or tomorrow or the next day or the next day, whatever it may be, and you all have a bit of an input to that, trying to get your risk list together. What you don't have on that list is that the mountain next to you, where you've lived and grown up and everything, is suddenly going to explode and spew out fire and lava and burn everything and destroy everything, within a certain radius. And also, you don't have that, something 5 kilometers wide is going to fall out of the sky and smash into the earth and cause a huge dust cloud, which is going to block out the sun and therefore kill everything off. You don't have those into your risk because they're inconceivable. They've never happened before. Nobody would in a million years come up with those two things as risks, because they're just completely bizarre. They're unprecedented. You wouldn't think that thing. And then, of course, the volcanoes erupt and the meteor smashes into it, and they've happened. The point is, they've happened. So once they've happened, they're no longer inconceivable. They have happened in the past. So when you talk about meteors crashing into the earth and volcanoes and everything else that we've mentioned on IPEC risks, the reason we're concerned about them is because there is a history that proves that these things can be realized. They're no longer inconceivable. So that you and your fellow lizards around there were quite right not to think about meteors smashing into the earth or volcanoes blowing up, because it's never been imagined. It was beyond the imagination. But now that it's happened, it's well within the purview of our imagination, and therefore, if there is a history of these things happening, and if they can have such catastrophic effects, should we not be considering them? So, to summarize, my view, and again, it is only my view, but I believe the distinction between an IPEC risk and a black swan event is that an IPEC risk is a black swan event that's already happened. That's the difference. Black swan events are entirely unpredictable. You don't know what they are, where they're going to come from. So the little lizards around there are facing black swan events. The events happen, now they're IPEC risks. Just quickly on the business continuity. Business continuity is not a risk. Business continuity is an objective, and that's all I've got to say on the matter. It irritates me that when people say, oh, these are business continuity risks. No, they're not. Business continuity is an objective. Business discontinuity is a risk. But business continuity is not a risk, and that's all I'm saying on that one.
Send all the emails to Tony on that one. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with Tony Thornton today on the topic of managing external risks, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Tony Thornton on the topic of managing external risks. Tony, lots of great information there, and I like the talk you had there with the lizards around the fire, and the black swans. I completely relate and understand that. But you also mentioned a little earlier the word of likelihood, and I'm wondering, is likelihood a good metric to measure risks with? What are your thoughts?
I think with IPEC risks, it's not. But before I go to the reasons, if I may, Alex, just to take a minute to distinguish between likelihood and probability, because the two are very distinct, and one is, I think, useful, and the other one I think has limited use. The useful one, of course, is probability. Now, for those listeners that aren't completely clear, to my mind, probability is a statistical, mathematical concept that works on the uncertainty of occurrences. So when you talk about probability, you'll never get an exact figure. You should always use a range because of all that uncertainty. So the uncertainty also has attached to it degrees of confidence. So that you can say with a certain degree of confidence, there is a certain range of probability of the occurrence of an event within a given time frame. That probability metric, that can be modeled and it can be tested in different scenarios that they call stress testing. And I think in that case of probability, there is a huge amount of value to be gained by including those probability studies in a detailed risk, a detailed assessment of our risk, given that probability is an inexact science. It deals with uncertainty, but nevertheless, the tools, what you can do with your decision trees and your Monte Carlos and everything else do have a very valuable place in the detailed risk assessment. That's as opposed to likelihood. To me, likelihood is a very qualitative concept. There's no measurement around it as such, and it depends very much on the individual's own assumptions and understandings of how likely something is. If we say, how likely is it to rain tomorrow? And I say, I don't think it's likely at all. And you say, I think it's pretty likely. Where are we now? We haven't really achieved anything except for disagreement. And if you compromise on that, you get in the middle. You're both, you're reporting something that was never in the discussion. So likelihood, in order to get around the problem with likelihood, people invented scales, and the most simple scale of likelihood, of course, is high, medium, low. High likelihood, medium likelihood, low. But you've got to define those. If you're going to say that something is of high likelihood, what do you mean by that? And what distinguishes that high likelihood event from a medium likelihood event? The barrier is the boundary between the two is very much a grey area, and so I guess somewhere along the line, some genius has got together and said, oh, we'll get around this problem by expanding that to make it a bit more clear. So now we have the 5-point classic, highly unlikely, unlikely, likely, very likely, almost certain. Well, that's terrible English already, isn't it? Or almost, it's almost certain. Anyway, but the point is, all you've done there is expounded the problem. I was listening to on the radio, there was a group of philosophers and they were talking about something called the paradox of boundaries. And they used a great analogy, which I'm going to steal from them because it was so graphic and it just explained everything so clearly. You take the state of a man that's got a head of hair, and then you start picking the hairs one by one out of that man's head. Right? So there are two states. There is not bald and there is bald. At which point is the man bald? which hair, when you picked it, turned that man's state in from being not bald to bald? You can't answer that question. It's a philosophical problem. When does the man become bald? And it's the same with the problem of the likelihood scale. You cannot define those boundaries between these ridiculous buckets of, highly unlikely, unlikely, likely, and therefore the whole scale is invalid. So for me, the likelihood scale, particularly with IPEC risks, doesn't work, which is why we just accept the events that happen, and you needn't worry about likelihood. Just very quickly on likelihood, to get around it again, there's another scale that people used. Hasn't happened in the last 20 years, hasn't happened in the last 10 years, hadn't happened in the last 5. Well, this is even more ridiculous than the last scale, I think, because the scale engulfs itself. If you pick the one that says hasn't happened in the last 20 years, well, by definition, that includes the scale that says hasn't happened in the last 10 years, hasn't happened in the last 5 years, and so on and so forth. So it completely destroys itself, that scale. And also, I could go on about this, but also if you're looking in the past to events that have really happened, is it right intellectually or academically to use that data to try and assess events in the future which haven't yet happened? So likelihood scales and the various applications and the various scales that have come, they don't do it for me, and certainly not with IPEC type risks. So the short answer is no, I don't like likelihood.
Believe it or not, we only have less than 4 minutes left. So quick question: how do you suggest managing IPEC risks?
Yeah, 4 minutes left. Okay. I suggest an ABCDE approach. First of all, you accept they're going to happen. You don't waste time worrying about the likelihood of them happen. We've been over this already, Alex. So I think that's your A. You accept that they're going to happen. The B is that once you've accepted they can happen, you get together and you brainstorm. You get the right people in the room and you brainstorm. Nothing is ridiculous, remember. Everybody's got a valuable input and nothing should be dismissed too easily. And you brainstorm in your local area and as much as you can in the wider supply chain, global business, about where those IPEC risks are. And if every business unit in your organization did that and you all collaborated and got together and consolidated that risk, what a rich data source that would be. Even richer if you collaborated and consolidated that with other companies in the same areas that have done the same thing. So that's the second thing. You brainstorm and collaborate. So that's a C. So you accept the risks, you brainstorm the risks, and you collaborate and consolidate the risks. And now we get to the D, which is the document risk. Now this is important because this is where it's going to get different to traditional risks. So with traditional risks, the documentation of the risk takes the risk from what is the likelihood of this risk event. Well, first of all, what's a risk event? What's the likelihood of the event that's going to happen? What's the impact of that event should it happen? Therefore, what's the assessment of that event? Therefore, what controls do we need to put in place? Therefore, what risk action plan do we have to mitigate that risk further? At the beginning, we talked about influencing risk. This is the influence part. What mitigation measures, what risk action plans can we develop to mitigate that risk? So key here, risk action plans to mitigate risk. That's tradition, and that covers strategy, operations, financial reporting, compliance, all the usual, the COSO, the usual risk categories there. IPEC risks, you do the ABC, which we've just talked about. You document those risks, right? But you don't just as you do with other risks, you list them in a risk register. What you do is you make a list of them down, let's say the y-axis. We're going to talk about a 3-dimensional axis. And 1 minute, okay, and then across the x-axis, you have your risk categories. I'm going to rush into pairs because everybody's heard of that. People, environment, assets, reputation, stakeholders. And the z-axis is time. So you do assessment over all these IPEC risks against your risk categories and your time. And then you exercise your scenario plan and you exercise.
And on that, we've come to the end of our show. Tony, great talking with you. Not that I did a lot. I know before we started, you said you hadn't done this type of thing before, but once you got going, obviously you've got passion in this, and it shows. So yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time. I really greatly appreciate it. I think this is really interesting. I like this IPEC risk. and we'll probably look into it a little bit more. So thank you very much, and for joining us from Abu Dhabi today.
Well, thank you, Alex. I've enjoyed our conversation immensely. I just hope that IPEC Risks now, the concept of IPEC Risks now catches on, and people get far more confident in talking about them, so that we can be better prepared for them in the future.
Agreed. Thank you once again. Have a great day. And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.